All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to crack the case on one of the most important skills you can have, not just in science or business, but in life: how to generate a really great hypothesis. We tend to think of this as some kind of eureka moment, right? A flash of pure genius. But what if I told you it's less about catching lightning in a bottle and more about learning to think like a detective? Let's grab our magnifying glass and get started. So really, how do those world-changing ideas actually happen? The ones that lead to brand new medicines or even entire industries. Is it just blind luck, some random spark? Well, the research we're digging into today tells a totally different story. It's not about waiting for an apple to fall on your head. It's about a systematic, focused process of investigation. And that, right there, is the big idea for our explainer. Breakthroughs aren't just conjured out of thin air. They're uncovered, piece by piece, clue by clue. The real secret? It's all about adopting what we're calling the detective mindset, a way of thinking that's skeptical, incredibly observant, and just relentlessly logical. Every great investigation has to start somewhere, usually with a crime scene. For our purposes, think of this as the moment we bump into a puzzle, an anomaly, something that just doesn't quite add up. This is where we find our very first clues and learn how to ask the right kinds of questions. It all kicks off with observation. And this isn't just passively looking around, it's an active search. What's really interesting is that the research points to anomalous observations as the most fertile ground for a new idea. This is that piece of data, that weird result that just doesn't fit with what we think we know. It's the one clue that makes a detective stop and say, wait a second, that's not right. I mean, look no further than the discovery of penicillin. It's the perfect case study, right? Alexander Fleming wasn't trying to find an antibiotic. He just noticed an anomaly, a contaminated, messy petri dish. But his observation of that strange little halo where bacteria refuse to grow sparked that critical question. What if the mold is making something that kills bacteria? It's just a prime example of how one unexpected clue can literally change the world. And that brings us to a super important point. Seeing the clue is just the beginning. It's the question you ask about that clue that defines the entire investigation. It's kind of like prompt engineering for reality, If you ask, how do we make this 10% more efficient? You're going to get small, incremental answers. But if you ask, how could we get the same result without this process at all? You're opening the door for a massive breakthrough. All right, so we've got our weird clue, we've framed our big question. What's next? Well, now the detective's job is to line up all the possible culprits. This brings us to stage 2, generating suspects, which really just means casting a super wide net for any and all potential explanations. This is the brainstorming part, the divergent phase. And the goal here is pure quantity over quality. And there's this amazing technique that comes from a pretty unexpected place, the CIA. They call it multiple hypothesis generation. They force their analysts to come up with at least 3 different explanations for any event. Why? To fight our natural tendency to just grab onto the first idea that sounds good. And you can use this anywhere. If a project's running late, don't just stop at the first excuse. Force yourself, force your team to come up with 3 totally different possible reasons why. So how do we actually come up with these suspects? Well, there are basically 3 ways our detective brain can work. First up is induction. That's just finding a pattern. You see a bunch of examples and you generalize. But like the turkey illusion shows, this can be super risky. Just because the market went up for 1,000 days straight doesn't mean it will on day 1,001. Then you've got deduction. This is pure, strict logic. It says, okay, if my hypothesis is true, then this other thing absolutely must happen. It's a great validity check. And finally, my favorite, the detective's real secret weapon, abduction. This isn't about patterns or logic. It's an inference to the best possible explanation. It's that creative leap from the server slow again to, you know what? It's probably a memory leak from that new patch we just pushed. Sometimes the best ideas, the most powerful hypotheses, they take real guts, real intellectual courage. This quote is such a fantastic example. For decades, every doctor in the world knew that ulcers were caused by stress and too much acid. The idea that a simple little bacteria was the real culprit, it sounded absurd. It was a suspect nobody was even considering, and to even suggest it meant you had to defy the entire medical establishment. The best detectives aren't afraid to finger the suspect nobody else sees. Okay, so we've got our lineup of suspects. Now the whole investigation pivots. We move from that creative anything-goes thinking to sharp, critical focus. It's time to build a solid case. And that means scrutinizing every single hypothesis and filtering out all the noise. So, The very first tool a detective uses to start weeding people out is plausibility. This is just a basic reality check. Does this idea violate the known laws of physics? Is it basically a perpetual motion machine? If the answer is yes, we can probably just set it aside. It's our first and most basic filter. But, and this is a huge but, we gotta be careful here. Plausibility can be a total trap. I mean, Einstein himself thought quantum entanglement, what he called spooky action at a distance, was just too bizarre to possibly be real. And yet, it is. The lesson here is that the universe has absolutely no obligation to make sense to our little human brains. So yeah, plausibility is a useful filter, but it is not foolproof. So if plausibility can be a trap, what's a better test? Well, it's this idea of falsifiability from the philosopher Karl Popper, and it is the absolute foundation of good science. It basically says that a real scientific hypothesis has to be, well, fragile. There has to be some theoretical observation out there that could completely destroy it. You have to be able to say, if I run this test and I see X, then my entire idea is wrong. If you can't say that, you don't really have a hypothesis you can test. You just have a belief. And there's one last super important step here. You gotta check the old case files. Do a literature review. This is to make sure you're not wasting your time on what the research we're looking at calls a zombie hypothesis, which is hilarious. It's an idea that's already been tested and shot down, but it just keeps shambling around because you didn't know it was already dead. You have to know what's already been tried before you can bring something new to the table. All right, we've done the work, we've narrowed down the field, we have our prime suspect, our strongest, most falsifiable hypothesis. Now, it's time to take it to trial. This is the phase where we design the perfect experiment that's going to reveal the truth, one way or another. And this is how that logical chain works. It's actually pretty straightforward. You start with your hypothesis, your best guess. Okay, I think bacteria cause ulcers. Then you make a logical deduction from that. Well then, if that's true, getting rid of the bacteria with antibiotics should cure the ulcers. See? That simple deduction then tells you exactly how to design your test. In this case, a randomized controlled trial is pretty much the only way to prove that cause and effect relationship. But hold on. Before we can even start the trial, we have to define our terms. First things first, is your idea even testable? This means you have to operationalize your concepts. For example, you can't really measure happiness directly. It's too abstract. So you have to turn it into something you can measure, like asking someone to rate their happiness on a scale of 1 to 10, or maybe even measuring their levels of the stress hormone cortisol. Once your ideas are measurable, then you can be crystal clear about your variables. What's the cause you're testing, the independent variable, and what's the effect you're measuring, the dependent variable. Okay, so the trial is run, the results are in, and now we get to the final act. But this is where the detective metaphor takes a really fascinating twist. The ultimate goal here isn't necessarily to get a guilty verdict. The real goal, the true purpose of all of this, is actually much deeper. It's all about learning. And this is maybe the most important takeaway of all. A hypothesis isn't some final capital T truth. It's a provisional understanding. Think of it like a placeholder truth. It's a working model of reality that you use to make decisions and predictions, right up until the moment better data comes along and forces you to update your model. A great example is a tech company's product roadmap. That roadmap isn't a statement of fact, it's just a series of hypotheses about what their users want, and it's ready to be completely changed the second the data tells them they're wrong. So what this means is that thinking about the verdict as just guilty or not guilty or, in science, proven or disproven, that's totally the wrong way to look at it. The real measure of success, the true verdict of your entire investigation, is something called the yield, the total number of new, testable ideas you were able to generate along the way. And honestly, this is where the rubber meets the road. The most innovative companies in the world get this. They're not trying to come up with one single, perfect, world-changing idea every year. No way. They're aiming to generate and test hundreds of small, testable hypotheses every single week. They know most of their ideas are going to fail. So the only way to speed up innovation is to increase the sheer volume of hypotheses they can put on trial. It's a pure numbers game. So there you have it. That's the detective mindset in action. It's a clear path from spotting a strange clue all the way to creating a flood of testable ideas. It's a skill you can learn, not some rare stroke of genius, and it's how real progress is actually made. Which leaves us with just one final question for you. I know you have a puzzle in your work or in your life that needs solving. So what's your first hypothesis?